Well, thank you all for coming. Those of you in person, braving Omicron and restrictions. Thanks for you online for joining. This is the first time I've actually chaired a conference in person in almost 2 years. Last year we did this, 2020, all entirely virtual. This is different. For one thing, I'm not wearing pajama bottoms. You can be happy about that. And this is also, I think, hopefully, we can sign of a new change overall in conferences in Latin America. COVID has been difficult. It's been a long year and a half, obviously. We had planned originally to have this conference in Mexico City at this time right now. But because of UK travel restrictions, it forced us to scale it back and have it here. We do still plan to have it in Mexico City in collaboration with COMEXI, May 23rd and 24th. So mark your calendars, please, and make your reservations. Barring any new variant of the coronavirus, we will be there. But we did scramble when we realized the travel restriction would make this difficult to have a smaller conference here in person and hybrid in London. And I want to thank actually our steering committee. Many of the members are speaking today: Andres Velasco, Mauricio Cardenas, Michael Reed, Vanessa Rubio, and Elena Lazaru, who helped us reconfigure the conference. I'd also like to thank the events team, Claire Smiley, and also the Americas team, Courtney Rice and Anar Bata, for scrambling and doing this. We had to do this, really put it all together in a couple months' time. So great work to everyone and appreciate it. I'd also like to thank the Corporación Andina de Fomento, the CAF, for sponsoring this conference. We'll hear a little while from Pablo Sanguinetti. But CAF has been instrumental in its support in helping Chatham House create a presence on Latin America. They supported the Latin America Conference originally in 2018, 2019, and 2020. We hope this will continue. I think it's very important in sort of creating a space for this discussion, not just in Chatham House, but in London more generally on Latin America, which, as I discovered when I arrived here just 2 years ago, very much there was a dearth of discussion on Latin America. So hopefully we've contributed in a small way to that. As I mentioned, it's been a long year, and it's been a particularly difficult year for Latin America. Just in the last, in 2020, depending on which numbers you look at, the Latin American economy, on average, in terms of its GDP, contracted from anywhere between 6.6% to 7.1%. This year, 2021, economic growth is supposed to, on average, reach 6.3%. Significant, but still not enough to overcome the deficit that was dug in 2020. And of course, as always in Latin America, a country of diverse economies, diverse countries, populations, there's a lot of variation within that. Brazil will grow, expected, by 5.2% this year, Chile by 11%, Mexico 6.2%, Colombia 7.6%, Peru 10%. That's leaving aside, of course, the economic basket case that is Venezuela. But even within those cases, we're seeing a dramatic growth in poverty. Within the region overall, what we saw was more than 4.7 million people in 2020 were pushed out of the middle class back into the poor. Poverty increased, I think it's a rather generous estimate, by 2% in 2020. And of course, with any unequal society, these costs were not borne equally. The people who particularly felt the effects of COVID and the contraction were primarily the poor, and within them, women, youth, indigenous, and rural communities felt the brunt of this in particularly sharp ways. Had it not been for a series of very fiscally generous policies, we would have seen even far more people fall into poverty. And while there may be some difficulties, and we'll talk about them today, in terms of sustaining the level of social programs that were implemented, by one estimate, more than 12 million people in Brazil alone would have fallen back into poverty had it not been rather aggressive fiscal stimulus packages and social aid packages that were implemented in that case by Jair Bolsonaro, somewhat unexpectedly perhaps given his reputation. But as I mentioned too, the youth felt a particular effect of COVID. Latin American students lost between a year to a year and a half of education. Also lost during this time, during the rates of unemployment, were new entrants into labor markets, the youth, and as we know from studies by labor economists, labor markets do not favor those who take longer to enter. The longer you stay outside of the markets, the longer it's difficult to enter. So there are long-term scarring effects, not just in the immediate increase in poverty, but in terms of the loss of education, the loss of access to labor markets that will be felt for a long time. That's not to say that all of this is going to be negative. Yes, there are some clouds on the horizon. There's the chance that interest rates will increase and reduce liquidity for governments, and the private sector in particular, that has extended itself in terms of public debt. Public debt increased by 15% in 2020, and now about 75% of GDP, this debt to GDP ratio is about 75%, 15% higher than it was before COVID. And you look at between 40 to 60% of the private sector right now is in arrears on debt payments. So the private sector too is suffering. But as I said, it's not all negative. First of all, the region is in a much better position in terms of its own debt, sovereign debt in particular, than it has been in the past. Sovereign debt is often now denominated in local currencies. Renewed growth in commodities markets we're seeing is leading to an uptick in growth in these regions. Hopefully this time those will be invested far better and more effectively than it was in the early aughts. And you also had the development of innovative social programs. And I don't mean to be somewhat of a Pollyanna here, but certainly we're forced to recognize the effect of COVID on the service sector, on the informal sector. The development of very aggressive social programs may, we hope, over the long term indicate a path forward for programs that can address long-term structural gaps and inequalities in these economies and societies. There's also the fact that there are elections. And again, I don't mean to sound like a Pollyanna, but we've had a raft of elections in this year, and we'll be having several more next year. This year, not in order, we have Chile, the Constituent Assembly elections, the presidential elections, Bolivia, Mexico, the midterm elections, Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, midterm elections, Honduras, just still counting the votes right now, just to name a few. And then, of course, I won't mention Nicaragua. When you jail 7 of the leading candidates, it doesn't count as an election. Call me a stickler for details. And then you have more elections to come. You have Brazil and Colombia, both very key elections. And while there are concerns about the direction of these elections, polarization and the candidates and the like, the truth is these elections are serving as a safety valve. Pent-up pressures that we began to see in 2019 are now finding expression in the ballot boxes. Again, that's not to say there aren't long-term partisan challenges and questions of the social programs and even the programmatic intent of some of these candidates and their leaders. The truth is that it has allowed for a certain amount of venting of political frustration. It may lead to the change in government from a deeply corrupt narcotic state in Honduras to a different government that is not to be underestimated. And hopefully over the course of this conference, we'll have a chance to talk about what those patterns are and what they mean. And in all of these situations, what we're seeing ideally are sets of patterns. And I would like to avoid us sort of coloring these elections by the pink tide or the red tide. I think thankfully we are getting a better sense of the nuance and the differences across these countries in terms of the election results. We don't hear the talk like we had of the pink tide or anyone try to attach a color to it. But obviously these are going to have an impact, and that's one of the things we want to talk about today. What impact will they have on political decision making, on political stability, on social demands, and even on foreign policy, which is the subject of our last panel. And it's undoubtable right now that when it comes to foreign policy, domestic politics, even in the United States and certainly in the UK as well, matter far more than they have in the past. So what does this mean in terms of Latin America's global role? What does this mean in terms of even its regional leadership and its plans to integrate? So what I'll do is the first panel we're going to have is Marcela Meléndez and Pablo Sanguinetti. We're going to talk a little bit about the economics and the effect of this contraction on different subsectors of the population. We then have a second panel on political trends with Michael Reed chairing. I'll let him do the introductions for that when the time comes. We'll have a break. And then we'll close with a panel on the impact of domestic politics on foreign policy. You have the agendas in front of you. If I can say so myself, I think it's a great lineup we have. One of the positive things of COVID, if I can say so, is that we now, I think, have become a lot more tolerant of virtual participation than we were before, and allows us to draw, I think, a number of very interesting people who wouldn't have been able to come here physically are now able to hear, and we can hear their insights from all over the world in this case. Let me just, in closing, before I open up the next panel, thank again the Corporación de Fomento, CAF, for its support for this conference and its support for the Latin America Initiative indirectly. I'd also like to thank our Latin America core supporters, BTG Pactual, HSBC, Fresnillo, Cairn Energy, and Equinor. And then I'd also like to thank, if you will, and I refer to him this, I don't think he always likes it, Andres Rosenthal, for basically creating the initiative for Latin America within Chatham House, and for his patience in this conference and for his support for this throughout. And you will get a chance to hear from him in the last panel. And then just a few housekeeping points. First of all, this is on the record. No Chatham House rule here. It's public, it's on the record, journalists are invited. Please keep your masks on when you're not speaking. If you do ask a question, you can take your mask off, but remain seated, and we'll come by with a boom mic to literally lower the boom on you so you can ask a question. If you want to tweet about this, please use the hashtag #CHLATAM. And then I'm going to try, in my capacity as chair now, and then of course later, to manage the questions. Virtual attendees, please ask your questions virtually in the Zoom function. In person, just go back to the traditional raise your hands. And then I'll try to balance between them as we sort of answer the question. I want to apologize in advance. I feel a little bit like my dad trying to figure out how to work the VCR when we first got one, which, by the way, it's self-dated. What's a VCR anymore? But I'm going to try to balance all these technical demands right here. And that's basically it. Please enjoy yourselves, enjoy the conversation. I hope you all participate actively in this, and I hope to see you much more in person in the future. So let me go to the first panel. Pablo Sanguinetti is Vice President of CAF, Corporación de Fomento. He's an economist, PhD from UCLA. Marcela Meléndez is the Chief Economist of UNDP. She has a PhD in economics from Yale University. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask them a set of questions. I like to chair these more as a sort of a conversation, if you will, among people who care a lot about the region or studying it. And the idea is I want Pablo to talk a little bit about the macroeconomics, and I'm going to give a plug here for Marcela's excellent report that was recently released with the UNDP, by the UNDP on sort of the differential effects of COVID and the economic contraction on different populations and on women in particular. So I'd like them to draw from that experience. So Pablo, let me ask you first, what are we looking at in terms of the economics, the recovery, and what are the differences across countries? We always have to remember that, we talk about Latin America in the aggregate, but obviously there's a lot of differences within the region by country and, of course, within the countries by population. So Pablo.
Well, Christopher, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, attending this important conference. This is not the first time I'm participating in a Chatham House event. I always enjoy very much the discussions, the dialogues, etc. So I'm also very delighted to have Marcela joining me in this panel. Well, let me go to your questions. You already said that the economies in Latin America are sort of recuperating or at a faster rate that we have anticipated, let's say, in April this year. At that time, we expected the region to grow at 4.5, and our numbers now is that the region as an average will grow like 6.5. And this is related with, let me say, two things. First, favorable external conditions. You mentioned one of that, the idea that the economy, the world economy is recuperating, is growing faster. Also, for example, US is growing at 6%, China is at 8%, emerging market at 6.2. So this has a positive implication for, of course, commodity prices that have been increasing a lot and still are like between 30 and 50% above pre-pandemic times. The second issue is that for some countries in Latin America, for example, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Bolivia, in Central American countries, remittances are important, and also they are high. For example, in Mexico during 2020, they were 40% higher and still are at a high level. So this is a second factor that helps the recovery. Third, the international financial conditions. We know the interest rates, international interest rates are very low because of the, the action of the Fed and also the European central banks. Of course, we have a little bit of uncertainty about whether monetary policy will be normalized in US, but we expect this to happen in a very, sort of slow motion manner. So it's not going to be a surprise. And this allows many countries in the regions to go to the markets and, get money to refinance their debts and also get some fresh money to finance the primary surplus to help the economy to recuperate. Within these international factors, what are positive, there is one factor that we have in a couple of 3 or 4 last months, which is not that good, which is this problem of, we all know, of the negative shock that is presented in the import production chains. So as the world economy reopens very fastly, some inputs and parts are kind of lacking, and these have already affected 2 important economies in the region, like Mexico and Brazil. The industrial production in Mexico, in Brazil have declined in the last 3 months compared to a quarter before, and also in Mexico, the industrial production is slowing down. So because of this issue. Now, let me go to what we expect to 2022, okay? So I would say that the second factor that is important for the recovery, of course, in this year, is the fact that Latin America has more or less controlled the pandemic. Infections have been down, deaths have been down, and many countries can reopen the economies, and especially the service sector. So the GDP, the output in those sectors increased a lot. Labor employment, as Marcela would say, I'm sure would say, is lagging a little bit. But this reopening of the service sector has been very important. So some countries like Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Chile are growing at almost 10% rates, 2-digit rates, just because of reopening. Now, let me go to to the 22 perspectives. We expect that the growing of the Latin America will go, will be reduced very important in a very important way. We go from 6.57% to 2.5, 2.3, 2.5, and this is why. The reason there are 3 reasons here. The first is that, of course, we don't have the rebound of a bad year like 2020, so this thing is not anymore there. Second, many of the fiscal stimulus measures that were put into place in many of the countries, and for example, Brazil was a kind of exceptional. It had like almost 8% of GDP expenditure in social expenditure transfers, but also Chile, Peru had huge expenditure. Well, many of these fiscal stimulus programs will be reduced in a very significant way. And not only that, on the monetary side, there also was a very, counter-cyclical policies. And we know, central bank reduced interest rate very rapidly in 2020 and the first half of 2021. But of course now inflation is also rising in many Latin American countries. And so many central banks are, increasing again the policy rates. And for some countries that inflation is very high, for example, Brazil has almost a 10% inflation rate in last October. So this also will kind of reduce aggregate demand and also reduce GDP growth for 2022. Maybe the most important reason to expect a low growth in 2022 is because now growth will depend on, on productivity growth, so more long-term determinants. And so that to increase growth from 2022 onwards, we need, to go to the old and maybe new challenges that the region faces to increase productivity. So this is kind of a very important issue. And if you want, I can take these things in the second round about what are these agenda for productive growth in the region?
Before we turn to Marcela, just can you give us, you started to talk a little bit about the differences, Brazil and Peru being very aggressive in their stimulus packages, but you also talked about the risk of unwinding those. Could you give us a little bit of variation among the countries? Let's look at, say, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil in terms of the risks there and how they're, I mean, obviously Mexico is doing far better because it was far less generous in its stimulus packages, but a little bit of differences.
Yeah, you're right. Mexico has a very kind of moderate packages because it fears, that the macro will deteriorate. Argentina has also kind of a very not that big package. Let's say Colombia has started a very moderate way, but then Colombia now have an important current account deficit, primary fiscal deficit, but also not only 2020, but also 2021. So I would say that the situation is different. Ecuador, for example, faces a very difficult situation because Ecuador, of course, as we know, has no exchange rate mechanisms to stabilize the economy. As has a dollar convertibility dollar framework, so that and now it's on an IMF package. So, for example, Ecuador needs to adjust fiscal policy in a harder way than other countries, and you will see the package in Ecuador was also very limited in terms of spending of help transfer, etc., and also will face very important cuts in expenditure next year, this year, next year. So I would take you. I will say something more maybe in the next round, but I see this affecting very strongly the public investment policies of many of our countries. We need that for growth, and this country will face a very difficult trade-off between, the necessity to sustain some social expenditures. Countries have, 1/3 of Latin Americans were out of the social security system. So many countries had to, build that from scratch. And so they increased transfers in Peru, in Brazil, in Colombia. And now people want this to be maintained. And, this is a very important policy change, how to reform those programs to make them first good for, to assistance for the poor people, but also to be incentive compatible so people could go, and have a formal job. Yeah. So this is quite a difficult scenario.
I want to get to that point in the final round of questions on sort of what sort of policy innovations may emerge out of this on a positive note, or even the political and social demands that could play out, especially on the informal sector, which represents, as we know, just a little less than 60% of the working class in Latin America. Marcela, you've done some great work on disaggregating, pulling apart the differential effects by populations. Can you give us a sense? Feel free to draw from your UNDP report and cite it, but give us a sense of what you see in terms of the effects, both in the short term as well as the long term, in terms of income and social and political and economic security.
Thank you, Christopher. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Pablo, for inviting me. And thank you for bringing my report into the conversation. I just want to say one thing about it. It was put together during the pandemic, and I had a lot of pressure to turn it into a pandemic report. And in the end, I won, and I refused to do that. And the reason is that this report addresses structural issues. The high inequality, low productivity trap that we're talking about was there before and will be there after we recover. So the first thing I want to point to is that recovering back to 2019 is not going to be good enough. No, in 2019 looks good now after 2020, but it's a very bad place to start. One of the factors that was ignored when we tried in the report, of course, we couldn't address all of the common factors of high inequality and low growth, but one of the key factors that was ignored by the report is education. And I want to start talking about that. I want to do a little propaganda of a joint initiative that was launched yesterday. We joined the World Bank in an effort to collect information from households throughout the pandemic. And the first wave of the second round that was done together by the two agencies was launched yesterday. I am going to tell you a little bit about what we're finding because I think it comes exactly to the point for this conversation. I think what happened to children and to youth in the education sector is one of the key issues that we are going to be talking in next years, and one of the issues that needs to regain the attention of governments and all other efforts. We see that attendance in these surveys that were collected between June and July of this year, we see that attendance has somehow recovered, but not it's still 20 percentage points lower than it was before. And we're talking about some sort of attendance. 86% of children in the region are having some sort of attendance to education services. The sad, horrible part is that on average, only 23% of children have had the opportunity to attend education in person. And this is as low as 7% in Ecuador, Peru, as I think 1% in Ecuador and Peru, 7% in Mexico, Chile and Colombia, only 9%. It's much higher in the Caribbean. But this is going to be the source of something that it will be very costly in the long run. And even within the children who were able to attend virtually, we know that there is a huge variance of the type of virtual education that children across the income distribution were able to have access to. So we see that we will have gaps between poor and rich children that will widen horribly, and that will widen over generations unless something is done. One good thing that happened during the pandemic is that we were able to extend internet coverage very quickly. It's not that we are at a full coverage in most of our countries, but we were able to close gaps between rural and urban populations. And this is like a sign that we faced in emergency moments, we have been able to deploy some sort of response that was actually good. But the pandemic here will not bounce back in an automatic way, and deliberate action is needed. With regards to labor markets, I think once if we are able to actually contain the pandemic and to deploy vaccination, then labor markets will bounce back to their bad equilibrium, but they will, and they have started bouncing back already. So the story is a little bit different there. In our data, we see that 1 in every 4 people have not yet recovered employment to their pre-pandemic levels, and that hours of paid work are 14% lower on average in the region. This has an implication. We find that 48% of households have not recovered pre-pandemic income levels, and this has happened regardless of the effort of policy response to bring transfers to households. So here, I guess another point to make is that even though we have seen a big deployment of effort based on transfer programs, in most countries, this really has been not enough. In Colombia and Ecuador, we see that 66% of households have not yet recovered income to their pre-pandemic levels. Peru is at 64%, despite the effort that looks important in terms of effort as a percent of GDP in terms of transfers programs. So we were set up in a way that was so bad to start with that we just didn't have the tools to respond. I probably, it would have been much different if we have had social insurance systems that work better and markets that were less informal to start with, so that we had all of the people in our radar. part of the cost of informality is that informal workers are not all poor. Not all of them were in social registries, and they were just not in the radar of governments. What we see in terms of what is happening with job recovery is that the new jobs are of lower quality. We see higher informality, and we see more self-employment and employment in tiny businesses. So we see, this is one of the ways in which this will be very costly for productivity dynamics and for growth. We already have a very high share of workers in this type of low productivity arrangements in Latin America and the Caribbean, where they have no possibility to improve their human capital through training in work. No, and this is part of the tragedy of the way in which our labor markets are set up, and maybe we can discuss why our markets are set up like this. In our report, we are saying that we have some distortive regulatory frameworks in labor markets, including the way our social protection systems are set up, that are causing us to be organized in such a way, which is self-destructive. But what we're seeing is that the way employment is recovering during the pandemic is pushing us even further in that direction. And the last thing I want to say is, of course, about the way women have fared during the pandemic in labor markets. Very quickly, there is a much lower recovery of employment for women, particularly women with young children, women who are mothers. We also see a lower recovery for younger workers and for workers with low education levels and low skill levels. We see that women are twice as likely as men to have stopped working at all. So we're going to see these gender labor participation gaps that we have been slowly closing over time, widening again. And this is a big concern. And what we are seeing is that women were, during the pandemic, much more in charge of supervising children during education than men. Let me stop there. Seeing you, too long.
No, fantastic. I'm going to get back. I want to just, can you give a sense to this, because you said it very well, that this shouldn't, your report and even the discussion shouldn't be just about the pandemic. It should be about the structural inequalities and perversions that sort of have led to an exaggerated effect on certain populations. Can you give us a sense of who's been most, you mentioned women, informal sector, but what about urban communities, rural communities, even give us, can you pull apart a little bit of the data in terms of who was most made vulnerable by this and what pre-existing structural conditions reinforce that?
I think we have mentioned those groups. I think here the poor versus rich divide is the more painful. We have allowed our societies to be too unequal. And this resulted in people going through the pandemic in very different ways. We spoke a little bit about children, but we have children on the lower extreme of the distribution who didn't have even a place to study, like a desk in their house. And this goes straight to the labor market, no? More educated workers, we have been able to work virtually and to keep on having an income. We have, like, all of the poorer workers were more concentrated in self-employment and in arrangements whereby the day that they stop going out from their house, they completely lose their income and they were completely unprotected. So I think it's this, like, I'd say I would start by income inequality, like the divide between rich and poor, and then the situation of women. I think the pandemic has basically unveiled, made like I don't know if it's been enough to make us realize how badly we were set up. The rural-urban divide is something that worries me a little bit less because for some reason the pandemic has, well, I guess because of the type of, like the form of contagion and the type of activities that we have in rural areas, the pandemic seems to have hit much less the rural communities in our countries. We even have stories that are unexpected because governments weren't able to actually target workers who lost their income. Some of them just used the registries, most of them just used their social registries to do transfers, and transfers that went to rural households in the end ended up lowering poverty to below poverty levels in some of our countries. That's an example of Colombia, for instance.
Great.
So the rural-urban divide, I don't see it as much here as with the other groups.
Thank you. Thank you. But I'm going to give another shameless plug for your report. It's available online, I assume?
It is available online. I am going to share, if you allow me, the link in the chat. And I am also going to share the link to the results of the high frequency household surveys that we launched yesterday. So that you can look, because there you can also look at the variance across countries.
Thank you very much. No, having lived in DC, I'm certainly not opposed to self-promotion or even material or data promotion. I want to get back, one of the things that's been said is that the pandemic forced us to take a look at the structural problems, deficiencies, dysfunction of many of these economies and societies. But let me flip it a little bit more positively now. Both of you represent different institutions. Pablo, you're in a development bank. Marcela, you're in a development organization, but a multilateral organization. What have we learned? Because I want to go for open questions. So if you very quickly, what have we learned? Is there something that, on the positive side that we've learned from this that has forced us to pay attention to inequalities, structural difficulties and gaps, productivity gaps in these economies that we should take away and refocus our energies in ways that we maybe had sort of taken our eye off the ball when we talked about the middle class, and in the early 2000s, the World Bank said, oh, it's anyone who makes more than $10 a day. Very fragile definition of the middle class, perhaps a dangerously fragile definition. What can we take away now, and what does it mean for development banks, bilateral assistance, and the like, and national governments? Pablo.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, let me say at two levels. One thing we learned is that having a balance, balance and good institutions at the macro level it worthwhile. Because, for example, countries like Peru, Chile, even Colombia, Brazil, etc., that have strong central banks, they have independent central banks, has also some fiscal institutions like fiscal rules, etc., were able to respond to the crisis in a much more expansionary way, doing countercyclical fiscal and countercyclical monetary policy. Those countries that do not have those kind of macro institutions were in much more trouble. And of course, the first country could go to the market once the market is stabilized to get funds for the recovery. So one thing is that an orderly macro framework is good, and it helped even in this crisis. The second lesson is that's not enough. That's not enough. Okay, so we had a huge, this is kind of a extraordinary problem. One is in 100 years, you have this kind of shocks. And for me, many countries face or try to solve this in a way as a business as usual way. So for example, CAF of course went to assist country with loans, technical assistance, etc. But we have some limit to help, to make loans because of our balance sheet. We have capital restrictions. We have our, the institutions that look at our balance sheet, that measure our, degree of financial wealth, etc., are looking at us. Also, some countries didn't want to get too much large debt because of that, because agencies that look at this. So I think that there was a lack of global cooperation to develop a kind of extraordinary solution for an extraordinary problem. So this way to go in the sense business as usual was not enough, even for countries that have been done their task, their duty in terms of fiscal and monetary policy. So that's one lesson that I think it came up very, very, very easily.
Thank you. Marcela, you mentioned social registries, but other, what have we learned? What can we take away from this? Necessity is the mother of invention.
As you said, UNDP is a different type of multilateral organization. So we see a role as, and I think this is also a shared role, as providing evidence to inform policy response. And the one reflection that I want to throw to the table is that I think we have been doing it wrong for a very long time. I think we're very good at talking with each other. And because these problems are structural, and we have been talking about them for a long, long time, and we're trying to find new ways to connect them and to bring the conversation to the key interlocutors, but I think we have not been doing it properly. I think we are not good communicators, and I think we're not being able to reach the proper audiences in order to trigger change. So that's a big concern looking to the future.
If you had David Malpass on the panel right now, what would you tell him the one thing he should do? David Malpass is the president of the World Bank, former economist from Bear Stearns, which no longer exists, but I'm sure that doesn't speak about his economic ability. Go ahead.
I think, I actually think we need to start opening dialogues on giving difficult conversations. Our chapter 3 in the report addresses an issue that has been there for a long time. It's the concentration of economic and political power in the region. And these are things we don't speak up loudly. And it's actually a difficult conversation to start from a multilateral organization, but we put it there because we think that the region needs to have this conversation, and we need to bring the private sector. So I think there is, of course, the World Bank president would be thinking about how to finance change, and there's like a lot of need, but that's another story. I think that the real story is how do we engage elites in society that can actually promote change, to have these conversations and to change the chips with which they have been functioning for a very long time. Understanding that they would be doing this not out of an altruistic, generous intention, but rather because we are shooting ourselves on the feet. I don't know if that's a saying that we have in Spanish, in the way we are organized.
Thank you. That's excellent. I'm going to open it up for questions. And thank you for your patience and letting me push you on this. We have 2 questions online. I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So if you have questions, I'm going to have them answered all at the same time, because fortunately I talk too long. So 2 questions. The first is from Andres Rosenthal. I don't know, Andres, if you want to ask it verbally, or can you do it, Andres? Kenny? Andres, you want to?
Yeah.
There we go.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Marcela and Pablo, for very scene-setting introductions to what we're going to be talking about during the conference. My question is really whether either of you think that Mexico and other countries that did not add to public debt with massive social programs to help the individuals and the small, medium-sized enterprises to survive through the pandemic was, with the benefit of hindsight, correct in terms of the macroeconomic policy for the countries? Or do you think that it was a mistake?
Fantastic. Thomas O'Brien has a question too, a very pointed question. Thomas, do you want to, is he unmuted?
Did that work? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, brilliant. So thanks all. My question is just, what policies would you like to see from the UK government to help Latin America's recovery? I know that's quite broad, but maybe if you could just pick a few countries.
That's a good question, being that we are a UK-based institution. Any questions from the audience? We have one from Katie and then one from Peter. Here come the boom mics, so get ready. Katie, here, and then, were there any over on this side? Okay, the 2 there. So Katie, introduce yourself, and then Peter, and then you, ma'am, and then Elena.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm currently at the University of Oxford. And I just wanted to ask, given that there have been so many missed hours of school for children across the region, and given that many are still very much out of school, what kind of new strategies do you think could be used to tackle these structural educational inequalities moving forward, kind of in the process of getting children back to school and beyond?
Thank you very much. Peter, go to you.
Peter West from EM Funding. My question is on Mexico as well. When you're analysing the paths of the recovery of the major economies of the region, I think it's very important to look at the level of GDP, not just the rates of growth. And when you do that, the country out of the big six, which is set to come out worst in terms of the level of GDP in 2021 compared to 2019, the country that's set to come out worst is Mexico, which is a bit of a mystery because, you know, Mexico should be benefiting from the strong recovery in the US. So my question is, why is Mexico performing so poorly? I think it's a bit linked to Andres' question as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Introduce yourself, ma'am, before you, and then I'll have you all answer these questions in a second, Pablo. Hope and Marcela, hope you're taking notes.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. Really a more pessimistic version of the first question. Given the huge deficit in education, which you mentioned, what do you see as the long-term prospects for different sectors in particularly the worst hit Latin American countries? And tying that in a bit to the comment that from next year, it has to be productivity that leads to Latin America growth. How pessimistic are you both over the medium to long term on Latin American growth?
Thank you very much. Elena. And then do we have anyone over here? That's it. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was most interesting. I'm Elena Lazaro. I'm an associate fellow here at Chatham House. My question would require a crystal ball, I think, but given that we are at the week where we're considering perhaps a new variant of the virus, and we see borders closing and travel suddenly slowing down, I was wondering if you would have anything to say about how a potential health crisis, if the vaccines don't work for this variant, how would that affect economic recovery and growth predictions that you both have been making? And also, do you think the economies in Latin America have become at all more resilient to such crises during adaptation, or will we be facing new, very, very bad numbers? Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Let's go in reverse order. Marcela, just quickly, you have Mexico, a number of questions, but the spending, it's relative decline, unexpected relative decline. You have a school, and in particular new strategies for addressing, again, sort of looking at the structural issues and using this as an opportunity. Long-term perspectives for specific strategies and productivity issues. Feel free to weigh in. I hear you were just in London a few weeks ago, so feel free to weigh in on what the UK should do. And then any predictions on the variants, and the same goes for you, Pablo, but Marcela, please.
So let me talk a little bit about education, because I think this is an area where, as I say, unless there is deliberate action to contain what we have been going through, this is going to be very costly in the long run in terms of inequality, of social mobility, and of economic growth for the region. We have learned that the internet is useful to do a lot of things virtually. We have somehow managed to extend internet coverage in many of our countries. We have not learned yet how to really use internet to improve education quality. And I think this is a challenge that needs to be addressed. Like, not only completing the connection of internet, like the access to internet, in particular, making sure that we give coverage to the poorest sectors of the population, but also finding ways to innovate in education in order to really take advantage of the internet as a tool for education quality. We are not yet there. We are not yet there in terms of content of education and of training and literacy of use of technology and of the internet from the sides of schools, teachers, children, and parents. So I think the internet is there in the picture of the future of education of Latin America. And it's also a way to bring, I'm going to say something that's probably politically incorrect, but I think we need to figure out how to engage differently with unions in the education sector that are one of the factors that have prevented increasing or improving the education levels and improving the type of teaching that we have in the region. So there's those two things, like how to really use the internet as a tool for education quality and how to engage differently with unions in education. With regards to what the UK can do, it really depends. If it's financial aid, I would say satellites that would extend internet coverage quickly in the poorest sectors. But there is also, I think, experience from which we can learn. And I would say two areas in which I think the UK would be an excellent ally. Civil service. In our countries, we don't really have good civil service. And in your country, you really have an exemplary arrangement of how this works. I think there is a lot of learning to do from example and from understanding the processes by which things that work well were built. And so the next one is how do you transit from tax systems that place a lot of burden on the productive sector and on firms and the corporate sector rather than on people and wealthy people? How do you transit to tax structures that are more healthy, in which individuals and households are the ones that bear the highest of the tax burden? I imagine that before getting to these tax systems that actually change the face of the income distribution, Europe was more similar to what we are not so long ago, I understand. So learning about how this process occurred may be helpful. So I see that type of collaboration as something that can be very, very important.
Let's hold it there. Sorry, my fault, we're running out of time. Sorry, plenty more to talk about on this. Hopefully we'll continue the conversation in other forums. Pablo, very quickly, Mexico, productive sectors.
Let me take Mexico. This is a kind of difficult question. Of course, Mexico have this perception that it could not go over to increase debt because rating agencies will, hurt the country, etc. And so they have this kind of very moderate policy. I think it helped in terms of course, of controlling fiscal deficit, controlling debt, but it has its cost. Mexico was one of the countries in where poverty increased the most because of not having that kind of transfers. Maybe Mexico will have such a big thing regarding the remittance that somehow it replaced a little bit, but it was not completely done. So it was good for a macro point of view, but it was not good for a social point of view. Let me go to what Great Britain could do, UK could do for Latin America. Besides what Marcela already said, I would say that the British government has been very advanced in terms of digitalizing the public sector. And this is something that Latin America is now doing. Actually, at CAF, we have a big program of digital transformation of the public sector. And many experiences of Great Britain are very important. So this is an area in which the UK could help. Another area that now maybe is not that stronger because now UK is left the European Union is to maintain open the trade market for Latin America goods. So this is also important. And on education, I would say the digitalization of the education is good, and virtual classes are okay. But for the poor guys, for the poor families, it's not a good replacement to presential type of thing. So we see that for a virtual class to work well, they have to have a lot of help from their parents. And if their parents have no education, have no time, etc., it will not work as a presential kind of classes. So we need to re-engage presentially many of our students, especially high school dropouts. The dropouts increased like 14 points. It went from 52 to 44%, the dropouts in high school. So this is a real thing that we need to do.
Let's leave it there, Pablo. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to give plenty, and I hope we can continue this conversation. I'm sincere.
Sure.
And thank you both for allowing me to push you a little bit on some of the answers and some of I think it was a much richer discussion, having the interaction, both of you here. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Pablo and Marcela for a good opening.